Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes, Book 6, Chapters 9 through 28. After his march from the country of the Menapii to that of the Treveri, Caesar determined to cross the Rhine for two reasons. First, because the Germans had sent the Treveri reinforcements to act against him, and secondly, to prevent Ambiorix from finding an asylum in their country. Accordingly, he proceeded to construct a bridge a little above the spot where he had crossed before. The principle of construction was perfectly familiar, and by great energy on the part of the men, the work was completed in a few days. Leaving a strong guard by the bridge in the country of the Treveri to prevent any sudden outbreak on their part, he transported the remaining forces, including the cavalry, across the river. The Ubii, who had previously given hostages and submitted, wishing to clear themselves, sent envoys to him to explain that no reinforcements had been sent from their country into that of the Treveri, and that they earnestly begged him to spare them, and not to make the innocent suffer for the guilty through indiscriminate animosity against the Germans, promising to give more hostages if he required them. On making inquiry, he found that the reinforcements had been sent by the Suebi. Accordingly, he accepted the explanations of the Ubii, and asked for particulars about the routes leading into the country of the Suebi. A few days later, he was informed by the Ubii that the Suebi were all concentrating their forces and warning the tribes under their sway to send their contingents of horse and foot. On receiving this information, he arranged for a supply of grain and selected a suitable spot for a camp. At the same time, he directed the Ubii to withdraw their flocks and herds and transfer all their belongings from the open country into their strongholds, hoping that the ignorant barbarians might be tempted by want of food to fight a battle in unfavorable conditions. And he instructed them to send numerous scouts into the country of the Suebi, and to ascertain what they were about. The Ubii fulfilled their instructions, and, after the lapse of a few days, reported that all the Suebi, on the arrival of messengers with trustworthy information about the Roman army, had retreated with all their forces, and those which they had raised from their allies, to the furthest extremity of their country, where there was an immense forest called Bacanus, stretching far into the heart of the continent, and, like a natural wall, protecting the Cherusci from the raids of the Suebi, and the Suebi from those of the Cherusci. On the outskirts of this forest, the Suebi had determined to await the arrival of the Romans. At the stage which this narrative has reached, it will not, I think, be irrelevant to describe the manners and customs of the Gauls and the Germans, and the points wherein the two peoples differ from one another. Factions exist in Gaul, not only among all the tribes, and in all the smaller communities and subdivisions, but, one may almost say, in separate households. The leaders of the rival factions are those who are popularly regarded as possessing the greatest influence, and accordingly, to their arbitrament and judgment belongs the final decision of all questions and political schemes. This custom seems to have been established at a remote period, in order that none of the common people might lack protection against the strong, for the rival leaders will not suffer their followers to be oppressed or overreached. Otherwise they do not command their respect. The same principle holds good in Gaul, regarding in its entirety the tribes as a whole being divided into two groups. When Caesar arrived in Gaul, one faction was headed by the Aedui, the other by the Sequani. The latter, being in themselves the weaker, for the supremacy had from time immemorial been vested in the Aedui, who possessed extensive dependencies, had secured the alliance of the Germans under Ariovistus, gaining their adhesion by lavish expenditure and promises. As a result of several victories, in which all the Aeduans of rank were killed, they had far outstripped their rivals in power, and annexing a large proportion of their dependencies, taking the sons of their leading men as hostages, making the authorities swear to form no designs hostile to the Sequani, seizing and occupying a part of their territory near the common frontier, and establishing supremacy over the whole of Gaul. Yielding to the inevitable, Diviciacus had undertaken a journey to Rome to solicit aid from the Senate, but had returned unsuccessful. On the arrival of Caesar, the situation was completely changed. The Aedui recovered their hostages, regained power over their former dependents, and gained new ones through the influence of Caesar. For the tribes who had allied themselves to them found that they were better off and more equitably treated than before, while in other respects their influence and prestige were increased. The Sequani, on the other hand, had lost their supremacy. Their place was taken by the Remi, and as it was known that they stood as high in Caesar's favour as the Aedui, the tribes who could not be induced on account of old feuds to join the latter ranged themselves among the dependents of the Remi. The Remi took care to protect them and thus secured the new authority which they had suddenly acquired. The situation at that time was this. The Aedui ranked far the highest in general estimation, while the Remi stood next to them in importance. Everywhere in Gaul 2 classes only are of any account or enjoy any distinction, for the masses are regarded almost as slaves, never venture to act on their own initiative, and are not admitted to any council. Generally, when crushed by debt or heavy taxation, or ill-treated by powerful individuals, they bind themselves to serve men of rank, who exercise over them all the rights that masters have over their slaves. One of the 2 classes consists of the Druids, the other of the Knights. The former officiate at the worship of the gods, regulate sacrifices, private as well as public, and expound questions of religion. Young men resort to them in large numbers for study, and the people hold them in great respect. They are judges in nearly all disputes, whether between tribes or individuals, and when a crime is committed, when a murder takes place, when a dispute arises about inherited property or boundaries, they settle the matter and fix the awards and fines. If any litigant, whether an individual or a tribe, does not abide by their decision, they excommunicate the offender, the heaviest punishment which they can inflict. Persons who are under such a sentence are looked upon as impious monsters. Everybody avoids them. Everybody shuns their approach and conversation for fear of incurring pollution. If they appear as plaintiffs, they are denied justice, nor have they any share in the offices of state. The Druids are all under one head, who commands the highest respect among the order. On his death, if any of the rest is of higher standing than his fellows, he takes the vacant place. If there are several on an equality, the question of supremacy is decided by the votes of the Druids, and sometimes actually by force of arms. The Druids hold an annual session on a settled date at a hallowed spot in the country of the Carnutes, the reputed centre of Gaul. All litigants assemble here from all parts and abide by their decisions and awards. Their doctrine is believed to have been found existing in Britain, and thence to have been imported into Gaul, and nowadays most people who wish to acquire a thorough knowledge of it go there to study. The Druids, as a rule, take no part in war, and do not pay taxes conjointly with other people. They enjoy exemption from military service and immunity from all burdens. Attracted by these great privileges, many persons voluntarily come to learn from them, while many are sent by their parents and relatives. During their novitiate, it is said that they learn by heart a great number of verses, and accordingly some remain 20 years in a state of pupillage. It is against the principles of the Druids to commit their doctrines to writing, though for most other purposes, such as private and public documents, they use Greek characters. Their motive, I take it, is twofold. They are unwilling to allow their doctrine to become common property, or their disciples to trust documents and neglect to cultivate their memories. For most people find that if they rely upon documents, they become less diligent in study, and their memory is weakened. The doctrine which they are most earnest in inculcating is that the soul does not perish, but that after death it passes from one body to another. This belief they regard as a powerful incentive to valor, as it inspires a contempt for death. They also hold long discussions about the heavenly bodies and their motions, the size of the universe and of the earth, the origin of all things, the power of the gods, and the limits of their dominion, and instruct their young scholars accordingly. The second of the 2 classes consists of the Knights. On occasion, when war breaks out, as happened almost every year before Caesar's arrival, the Knights, either attacking or repelling attack, They all take the field, and surround themselves with as many armed servants and retainers as their birth and resources permit. This is the only mark of influence and power which they recognize. The Gallic people, in general, are remarkably addicted to religious observances, and for this reason persons suffering from serious maladies, and those whose lives are passed in battle and danger, offer or vow to offer human sacrifices, and employ druids to perform the sacrificial rites, for they believe that unless for man's life, the life of man, be duly offered, the divine spirit cannot be propitiated. They also hold regular state sacrifices of the same kind. They have, besides, colossal images, the limbs of which, made of wickerwork, are filled with living men and set on fire, and the victims perish, encompassed by the flames. They regard it as more acceptable to the gods to punish those who are caught in the commission of theft, robbery, or any other crime, but in default of criminals they actually resort to the sacrifice of the innocent. The god whom they most reverence is Mercury, whose images abound. He is regarded as the inventor of all arts, and the pioneer and guide of travelers. He is believed to be all-powerful in promoting commerce and the acquisition of wealth. Next to him, they reverence Apollo, Mars, Jupiter, and Minerva. Their notions about these deities are much the same as those of other peoples. Apollo they regard as the dispeller of disease, Minerva as the originator of industries and handicrafts, Jupiter as the suzerain of the celestials, and Mars as the lord of war. To Mars, when they have resolved upon battle, they commonly dedicate the spoils. After victory, they sacrifice the captured cattle, and collect the rest of the booty in one spot. In the territories of many tribes are to be seen heaps of such spoils, reared on consecrated ground, and it has rarely happened that anyone dared, despite religion, either to conceal what he had captured, or to remove what had been consecrated. For such an offense the law prescribes the heaviest punishment with torture. The Gauls universally describe themselves as descendants of Dis Pater, affirming that this is the druidical tradition. For this reason they measure all periods of time not by days but by nights, and reckon birthdays, the first of the month, and the first of the year, on the principle that the day comes after the night. As regards other customs of daily life, about the only point in which they differ from the rest of mankind is this: they do not allow their children to come near them openly, until they are old enough for military service, and they regard it as unbecoming for a son, while he is still a boy, to appear in public where his father can see him. It is the custom for married men to take from their own property an amount equivalent, according to valuation, to the sum which they have received from their wives as dowry, and to lump the two together. The whole property is jointly administered, and the interest saved, and the joint shares of husband and wife, with the interest of past years, go to the survivor. Husbands have power of life and death over their wives, as well as their children. On the death of the head of a family of high birth, his relations assemble, and, if his death gives rise to suspicion, examine his wives under torture, like slaves, and if their guilt is proved, burn them to death with all kinds of tortures. Funerals, considering the Gallic standard of living, are splendid and costly. Everything, even including animals, which the departed are supposed to have cared for when they were alive, is consigned to the flames, and shortly before our time, slaves and retainers, who were known to have been beloved by their masters, were burned along with them after the conclusion of the regular obsequies. The tribes, which are regarded as comparatively well governed, have a legal enactment to the effect that if any one hears any political rumor or intelligence from the neighboring peoples, he is to inform the magistrate and not communicate it to anyone else, as experience has proved that headstrong persons who know nothing of affairs are often alarmed by false reports and impelled to commit crimes and embark on momentous enterprises. The magistrates suppress what appears to demand secrecy and publish what they deem it expedient for the people to know. The discussion of politics, except in a formal assembly, is forbidden. The manners and customs of the Germans differ widely from those just described. They have no druids to preside over public worship, and care nothing for sacrifices. The only deities whom they recognize are those whom they can see, and from whose power they derive manifest benefit, namely, sun, moon, and fire. The rest they have not even heard of. Their lives are passed entirely in hunting and warlike pursuits, and from infancy they are inured to toil and hardship. Those who preserve their virginity longest are the most respected by their fellows, for it is considered that by such continence stature and strength are developed, and nerve invigorated. Indeed, to have connection with a woman before her 20th year is thought most disgraceful. Concealment is impossible, as they bathe promiscuously in rivers, and wear only hides or small cloaks of reindeer skin, leaving a large part of the body bare. The Germans are not an agricultural people, and live principally upon milk, cheese, and meat. Nobody possesses any landed estate or private demesne. The authorities and chieftains annually assign to the several clans and groups of kinsmen assembled at the time as much land as they think proper, in whatever quarter they please, and in the following year compel them to remove to another place. Many reasons are assigned for this custom: that men may not become slaves of habit, lose their zest for war, and take to agriculture instead; that the strong may not aim at the acquisition of large estates and dispossess those of low degree; that they may not build with elaboration, to avoid heat and cold, to prevent the growth of avarice, which gives birth to party spirit and dissension, and to keep the masses contented and therefore quiet by letting everyone see that he is as well off as the most powerful. The greatest distinction which a tribe can have is to be surrounded by as wide a belt as possible of waste and desert land. They regard it as a tribute to their valor that the neighboring peoples should be dispossessed and retreat, and that no one should venture to settle in their vicinity. At the same time, they count on gaining additional security by being relieved from the fear of sudden attacks. When a tribe has to repel or to make an attack, officers are chosen to conduct the campaign and invested with powers of life and death. In time of peace there is no central magistracy. The chiefs of the various districts and hundreds administer justice and settle disputes among their own people. No discredit attaches to predatory expeditions outside the tribal boundary, and the people tell you that they are undertaken in order to keep the young men in training and to prevent laziness. Whenever any of the chiefs announces his intentions in the assembly of leading an expedition and calls for volunteers, those who approve the enterprise and the leader stand up and promise to help, and the whole gathering applaud them. Those who do not follow their leader are counted as deserters and traitors, and thenceforth they are no longer trusted. To ill-treat a guest is regarded as a crime. Those who visit them, from whatever motive, they shield from injury, and regard their persons as sacred. Every man's house is open to them, and they are welcomed at meals. Once there was a time when Gauls were more warlike than Germans, actually invading their country, and on account of their dense population and insufficient territory, sending colonies across the Rhine. Thus the Volcae Tectosages occupied the most fertile regions of Germany round the Hercynian forest, which I find was known by name to Eratosthenes and other Greeks, who called it Orcynia, and there settled. To this day the people in question, who enjoy the highest reputation for fair dealing and warlike powers, continue to occupy this territory. The Germans still live the same life of poverty, privation, and patient endurance as before, and their food and physical training are the same, while the Gauls, from the proximity of the provinces and familiarity with seaborne products, are abundantly supplied with luxuries and articles of daily consumption. Habituated little by little to defeat, and beaten in numerous combats, they do not even pretend themselves to be as brave as their neighbors. The Hercynian forest, above mentioned, extends over an area which a man, traveling without encumbrance, requires 9 days to traverse. There is no other way of defining its extent, and the natives have no standards of measurement. Starting from the frontiers of the Helvetii, Nemetes, and Raucari, it extends right along the line of the Danube to the frontiers of the Dacians and Anartes. Then, bending to the left, and passing through a country remote from the river, it borders, so vast is its extent, upon the territories of many peoples, and no one in western Germany can say that he has got to the end of the forest, even after travelling right on for 60 days, or has heard whereabouts it begins. It is known to produce many kinds of wild animals, which have never been seen elsewhere. The following, on account of their strongly marked characteristics, seemed worthy of mention. There is a species of ox, shaped like a stag, with a single horn standing out between its ears from the middle of its forehead, higher and straighter than horns as we know them. Tines spread out wide from the top, like hands and branches. The characteristics of the male and female are identical, and so are the shape and size of their horns. Again, there are elks, so called, which resemble goats in shape, and in having piebald coats, but are rather larger. They have blunt horns, and their legs have no knots or joints. They do not lie down to sleep, and if by any chance they are knocked down, they cannot stand up again, or even raise themselves. Their resting places are trees, against which they lean, and thus rest in a partially recumbent position. Hunters mark their usual lair from their tracks, and uproot or cut deep into all trees in the neighborhood, so that they just look as if they were standing. The animals lean against them as usual, upset the weakened trunks by their mere weight, and fall down along with them. There is a third species called aurochs, a little smaller than elephants, having the appearance, color, and shape of bulls. They are very strong and swift, and attack every man and beast they catch sight of. The natives sedulously trap them in pits and kill them. Young men engage in the sport, hardening their muscles by the exercise, and those who kill the largest head of game exhibit the horns as a trophy, and thereby gain high honor. These animals, even when caught young, cannot be domesticated and tamed. Their horns, in size, shape, and appearance, differ widely from those of our oxen. The natives, who are fond of collecting them, mount them round the rim with silver, and use them as drinking cups at grand banquets. End of Book 6, chapters 9 through 28. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 6, chapters 29 through 44. After ascertaining from the Ubian scouts that the Suebi had retreated into their forests, Caesar determined to advance no further. The Germans, as we have explained above, pay very little attention to agriculture, and he was therefore afraid of running short of corn. Still, to avoid releasing the natives altogether from the fear of his return, and to delay their reinforcements, after withdrawing the army, he broke down the end of the bridge, for the length of 200 feet, which touched the Ubian bank, erected a tower with 4 stories on its extremity, and posted a detachment of 12 cohorts to protect the bridge, fortifying the position with strong works. A young officer, Gaius Fulcacius Tullus, was placed in command, and charged with the defense of the position. Now that the crops were beginning to ripen, Caesar started in person to conduct the campaign against Ambiorix, taking the route through the Ardennes, the largest forest in the whole of Gaul, which extends from the banks of the Rhine, the Treveran frontier, to the country of the Nervii, a distance of more than 500 miles. He sent on ahead Lucius Minucius Ballius, with all of the cavalry, in the hope that by marching rapidly, and so arriving in good time, he might be able to strike an effective blow, and joined him not to allow fires to be lighted in his camp, that there might be no distant sign of his approach, and promised to follow him immediately. Basilius carried out his instructions. Making a rapid march, which upset all calculations, he surprised and seized a large number of men in the open country, and, following their directions, hastened to a place where Ambiorix himself, with a few horsemen, was said to be staying. Fortune is a great power in war, as in all other affairs. By a rare chance, Basilius came upon Ambiorix himself, while he was still off his guard and unprepared, and they all saw him coming before his approach was rumored or announced, and by great good luck, although all the equipment which he had with him was looted and his carriages and horses seized, Ambiorix himself escaped death. His escape, however, was partly due to the fact that his house, like the dwellings of the Gauls in general, was surrounded by a wood, for, in order to escape the heat, they generally looked for sites near woods and rivers, and accordingly his retainers and friends resisted for a time, in this confined space, the onslaught of our horsemen. While they were fighting, one of his followers mounted him on horseback, and the woods covered his flight. Thus fortune had much to do both with his peril and with his escape. Whether Ambiorix deliberately refrained from collecting his forces in the belief that it would be unwise to fight, or whether his inaction was due to want of time and the sudden arrival of the cavalry, which made him believe that the rest of the army was following, is doubtful. At all events, he sent out messengers over the countryside, bidding every man shift for himself. Some fled into the Ardennes, others to unbroken stretches of morass. Those who lived nearest the ocean hid themselves in districts periodically insulated by the tides. Many quitted their own country, entrusted their lives and all that they possessed to utter strangers. Catuvolcus, who, as king of one half of the Eburones, had joined in the enterprise of Ambiorix, and was now a worn-out old man, unable to stand the hardships of campaigning or of flight, heartily cursed Ambiorix for having planned the enterprise, and poisoned himself with yew, a tree which grows abundantly in Gaul and Germany. The Segni and Condrusi, who are Germans by race and are reckoned among that people, and dwell among the Eburones and Treveri, sent envoys to Caesar, begging him not to count them as enemies, or to assume that all the Cisrhenane Germans were associated, and assuring him that they had never dreamed of war, and had sent no reinforcements to Ambiorix. Caesar, after testing their statements by examining prisoners, ordered them to hand over to them any Eburonian fugitives who joined them, and promised not to molest their country if they obeyed. He then broke up his forces into 3 divisions, and transferred the heavy baggage of all the legions to Aduatuca. The name denotes a fort, in which Titurius and Aurunculeius had established themselves for the winter, and which is nearly in the center of the country of the Eburones. Amongst other reasons, Caesar had selected the position in order to spare the soldiers fatigue, as the fortifications made in the preceding year were still standing. Leaving the 14th Legion, one of the 3 which he had brought from Italy, where they had recently been raised, to protect the baggage, he entrusted Quintus Tullius Cicero with the command of it and the defense of the camp, and assigned him 200 cavalry. After dividing the army, he ordered Titus Labienus to move towards the ocean with 3 legions into the districts bordering upon the country of the Menapii, and sent Gaius Trebonius with the same number to devastate the region adjacent to the country of the Aduatuci, while he determined to march himself with the remaining 3 legions towards the river Scheldt, which flows into the Meuse and the most distant parts of the Ardennes, whither he had heard that Ambiorix had gone with a few horsemen. On his departure he announced his intention of returning at the end of a week, when, as he was aware, the rations of the legions left on guard would be due. He enjoined Labienus and Trebonius to return by that day, if they could do so consistently with the public interest, so that, after comparing notes anew and ascertaining the enemy's methods, they might be able to form a fresh plan of campaign. As we have remarked above, there was no organized body, no stronghold, and no force capable of armed resistance. The population was dispersed in all directions. Everyone had taken up his abode in any remote glen or wooded spot, or impenetrable morass that offered him a chance of defending himself or of saving his life. The people near these places knew the ground, and great care was required, not indeed of protecting the army as a whole, for while the troops were massed no danger could befall them from a panic-stricken and scattered enemy, but to secure the safety of individual soldiers, and yet this in some measure concerned the safety of the whole army. Lust for plunder led many far afield, and the woods with their ill-defined and dusky paths defied compact bodies to enter them. If Caesar meant to finish the task outright and slaughter the whole brood of scoundrels, he must send out numerous parties and break up the troops into detachments. If he chose to keep his companies in formation, according to the established and familiar system of the Roman army, the The natives were protected by the nature of the country, and the individuals among them had courage enough to lie in ambush and cut off scattered parties. In these difficult circumstances, all possible care and forethought were exercised, for it was determined to forego some advantage in punishing the enemy, although all were burning for revenge, rather than to punish him at the cost of any loss of the men. Caesar sent messengers to the neighbouring tribes, holding out to all the hope of plunder and inviting them to harry the Eburones, for he intended the Gauls should risk their lives in the forests and not his legionaries, and at the same time to surround the people with a mighty host, and in requital for their signal villainy, to destroy them, root, branch, and name. Large numbers speedily assembled from every side. While these events were passing in all parts of the Eburonian territory, the last day of the week was approaching, by which time Caesar had determined to return to the legion that guarded his baggage. Now occurred an instance of the power which fortune wields in war, and of the hazards of which fortune is fraught. The enemy, as we have pointed out, were scattered and panic-stricken, and there was no force to give the slightest ground for alarm. The rumor made its way across the Rhine to the Germans that the Eburones were being harried, and, what was more, that all comers were invited to plunder them. The Sugambri, who dwelt in the immediate neighbourhood of the Rhine, and who, as we have stated above, sheltered the Tencteri and the Usipetes after their flight, raised 2,000 horse, crossed the Rhine in barges and on rafts 30 miles below the spot where Caesar had built his bridge and had left a garrison, invaded the nearest part of the Eburonian territory, captured a large number of scattered fugitives, and seized a great quantity of cattle, which uncivilized peoples greatly prize. Lured on by the hope of plunder, they advanced further, and these born warriors and freebooters were not to be stopped by marsh or forest. They asked their prisoners whereabouts Caesar was, found that he had gone far away, and satisfied themselves that his whole army had quitted the neighbourhood. Thereupon one of the prisoners asked, "Why go after this wretched, worthless loot, when in a twinkling you can make your fortunes? In 3 hours you can get to Aduatuca, where the Roman army have stored all their belongings. The garrison are a mere handful, unable even to man the wall, and not a soul dares stir out of the entrenchments." Here was the chance. The Germans concealed and left behind the booty that they had got, and pushed on for Aduatuca, guided by the man from whom they had learned the news. Cicero, in obedience to Caesar's instructions, had been most careful to keep his troops every day in camp, not allowing a single servant to stir outside the entrenchment. On the 7th day, however, hearing more than once that Caesar had advanced to a great distance, and not receiving any intimation of his return, he was afraid that he would not keep his appointment, and at the same time he was disquieted by the remarks of the men, who said that, if one mightn't even leave the camp, what he called patience was virtually submission to blockade, and with 9 legions and a powerful body of cavalry in the field, and an enemy scattered and all but annihilated, he never expected such a contingency as a disaster within 3 miles of camp. Accordingly, he sent 5 cohorts to reap the nearest crops, which were only separated from the camp by a solitary hill. Many invalids belonging to the various legions had been left in camp. About 300 of these, who had recovered in the course of the week, were sent out with the cohorts under a separate command, and a large number of servants got permission to go as well, with a great quantity of baggage cattle, which had been stabled in the camp. Just at this critical moment, up came the German horsemen, and, riding on without slackening speed, tried to break into the camp at the rear gate. Woods obstructed the view on that side, and they were not seen till they were getting close to the camp, so that the traders, whose tents were at the foot of the rampart, had no chance of retreating. Our men, being off their guard, were startled by the suddenness of the attack, and the cohort on duty barely withstood the first shock. The enemy spread round the other sides to see if they could find an entrance. Our men with difficulty defended the gates, but the strength of the position, as well as the entrenchments, forbade any attempt to enter elsewhere. The whole camp was a scene of confusion, every man asking his neighbor the reason of the uproar, and there was no attempt to determine where the troops should advance or at what point the men were to fall in. One declared that the camp was already taken. Another insisted that the natives had come, flushed with victory from destroying the army and the chief. Nearly all, remembering where they were, conceived superstitious fancies, and pictured to themselves the disaster that had befallen Cotta and Titurius, who, as they imagined, had perished in the same fort. All being thus panic-stricken, the barbarians were confirmed in the notion, derived from their prisoner, that there was no force within. Striving to break through, they exhorted each other not to let such a chance slip from their grasp. Publius Sextius Baculus, who had served under Caesar's command as principal centurion, and who has been mentioned in connection with earlier engagements, had been left invalided in the garrison and had not tasted food for 5 days. Feeling anxious for his own safety and that of his comrades, he walked unarmed out of his tent, and seeing the menacing attitude of the enemy and the extreme peril of the situation, borrowed weapons from the man nearest him and planted himself in the gateway. The centurions of the cohort of the guard followed him, and for a short space they sustained the brunt of the fight together. Severely wounded, Sextius fainted, and was with difficulty saved by being passed along from hand to hand. The breathing space thus gained enabled the rest to pluck up courage enough to man the fortifications and to make a show of defense. Meanwhile our soldiers, who had finished cutting the corn, heard the din from afar. The horsemen rode on ahead, and learned the gravity of the danger. There was no entrenchment here to shelter the men in their terror. Raw recruits, with no experience of war, they turned to their tribune and centurions, waiting for orders. Not one of them had the courage to keep cool in the face of the unexpected. The barbarians descried the standards in the distance and abandoned their attack. At first they believed that the legions, which, as they had learned from their prisoners, had gone on in a distant expedition, had returned. But afterwards, seeing that they were a mere handful, they charged them on every side. The servants ran forward to a knoll close by. They were speedily dislodged and rushed pell-mell into the maniples as they stood in line, thereby increasing the terror of the soldiers. Some voted for forming in a wedge and making a rapid dash through the enemy, urging that, as the camp was so near, most of them could escape, even if a few of them were cut off and killed. Others for standing firm upon the hill, and all taking the chance together. The veterans, who, as we have stated, had gone out with the rest under a separate command, disapproved of this suggestion. Accordingly, led by Gaius Trebonius, a Roman knight, who had been placed in command of them, they charged with mutual exhortations through the midst of the enemy, and reached camp without the loss of a man. The servants and cavalry, following close behind, joined in the charge of the infantry, and owed their escape to their courage. Those, however, who had taken their stand upon the hill, and who even now had not learned what fighting meant, could neither abide by their own resolution and defend themselves on their position of vantage, nor imitate the swift energy which, as they saw, was the salvation of the others, but in their attempt to get back to camp abandoned the advantage of their position. The centurions, some of whom had been promoted for valor from the lower grades of the other legions to the higher grades of this, determined not to forfeit the credit that they had earned in the field, and died fighting with the greatest gallantry, their brave stand compelling the enemy to fall back. Some of the soldiers unexpectedly reached camp in safety. The rest were surrounded by the natives and perished. The Germans, seeing that our men had by this time manned the works, abandoned the hope of storming the camp, and recrossed the Rhine with the booty which they had left in the woods. Even after they had gone, the panic was so great that Gaius Volusianus, who had been sent on with the cavalry, on arriving in camp that night, could not make the men believe that Caesar was close by, and the army with him, safe and sound. Fear had so completely taken possession of them that they were almost beside themselves, and maintained that the whole force must have been annihilated, and that the cavalry alone escaped the rout. For, they insisted, if the army had been safe, the Germans would not have attacked the camp. Caesar's arrival, however, dispelled the panic. Caesar was well aware that in war it is the unexpected that happens. On his return, therefore, he made no complaint, except that the cohorts had been allowed to leave their proper place in the garrison, remarking that no opening should have been left even for the slightest accident, and he considered that fortune had shown her great power in the enemy's sudden arrival, and still more in having repelled the natives when they had all but gained the rampart and the gates of the camp. The most remarkable point in the whole incident was that the Germans, having crossed the Rhine with the object of ravaging the territories of Ambiorix, had been led to attack the Roman camp, and had thereby done Ambiorix the greatest service that he could desire. Caesar sent out once more to harry the enemy, and having got together a great horde from the neighbouring tribes, let them loose in every direction. Every hamlet, every building that was to be seen was fired. Cattle were driven in from all parts, and the corn was not only devoured by the immense multitude of horses and men, but also laid by the autumnal rains. In fact, it seemed certain that if any of the inhabitants concealed themselves for the time, they must perish after the withdrawal of the army from utter destitution. The cavalry, which was very numerous, was sent out in all directions. Often success was all but in their grasp, for prisoners who had just descried Ambiorix making off looked round and insisted that he was barely out of sight, so that his pursuers, seeing a chance of running him down, made Herculean efforts, and, in the expectation of winning Caesar's favour, showed almost superhuman zeal. But always they seemed just to miss complete success. The quarry broke away from wooded glade or other lair, and hiding in the night made for another part of the country. His only escort was 4 horsemen, to whom alone he ventured to trust his life. After ravaging the districts in this way, Caesar led back his army, with the loss of 2 cohorts, to Dura Cotorum, in the country of the Remi, at which place he convened a Gallic council, and proceeded to hold an inquiry into the conspiracy of the Senones and Carnutes. He pronounced the extreme sentence on Acco, the author of the movement, and executed him in the time-honoured Roman fashion. Some of the conspirators, fearing to be brought to trial, fled, and Caesar interdicted them from fire and water. Having quartered 2 legions for the winter close to the Treveran frontier, 2 among the Lingones, and the remaining 6 at Agedincum in the country of Senones, and arranged for a supply of corn for the army, he set out, according to his custom, for Italy to hold the assizes. End of Book 6, chapters 29 through 44.